Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Talent Equation. Today I've got Dan Cottrell on the show. Dan, welcome to the Talent Equation.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here on this delightful Saturday morning. Just wanted to really, I suppose, start the ball rolling by I wonder if you could kind of just tell everybody a bit about yourself and your journey and how you've arrived to where we are and some of the conversations that we've been having via Twitter and in different spaces.
Oh, well, thanks, Stu. I mean, I grew up in the West Country and my favourite sport was cricket. I think you enjoy your cricket as well. And then as I got older, I got a bit better at rugby and eventually university sort of broke through a bit with rugby and then went into school teaching after becoming an accountant. That's often a journey that some people make. And when I was a schoolmaster, I loved the rugby, became a director of rugby at a big private school in Surrey. And then when I was doing that, I started up a magazine. This was about 2003, and in 2003, if people can remember back that far, Google was just about coming online itself and becoming more popular, and the guys I was doing the magazine with discovered Google themselves, and suddenly they were, instead of it becoming a hobby, it could become a full-time job. So I stopped teaching and started to write about coaching rugby. And the great thing about that has been obviously talking and writing about rugby, but actually being exposed to an enormous number of coaches from a vast array of backgrounds. And I can tell you that they're exciting every time you talk to them. Even if they're saying something different to the last one, they bring a sort of energy. And as people who listen to this podcast will know, anyone who's in coaching loves to discuss it, loves to talk around different points and share. And one of the great things I found is the number of people who are willing to share. So how have I got to where we are today? Well, I think Twitter's been a great way of sharing bites of information and sharing files, and Stu and lots of people around you guys have been doing that, and I've been following it and listening and jumping in, sometimes just putting my head above the parapet, but very happy when you guys say something and everyone fires in, and then I think, oh well, I'll come in and bat for them and see what I can add. Sometimes asking questions, sometimes putting in my thoughts, and so it was really we have a bit of a conversation about the difference between drills and games. Not the difference. I'm going to be very careful not to say the difference between. There are some little crossovers, perhaps, but mainly in coaching parts of games which have some form of safety element or some form of danger. So inevitably, rugby will be probably at the forefront, but I'm sure that it will cover across a number of sports, and I'm expecting you, Stu, just to jump in and say, well, that would be appropriate if we were coaching some other sport. I know a little bit about football, by the way. However, I am a Bristol Rovers supporter, so I don't know whether that then puts me up at the top in terms of understanding football or near the bottom. So there I am. That's my journey so far.
So, brilliant. Right at the forefront of the information revolution, and you've been contributing to the kind of online debate and been a source of information and a content provider, helping other coaches to within rugby to be able to improve. I mean, I often feel. I mean, we'll obviously get onto the safety stuff definitely in the conversation, but I often feel quite jealous. I before Google came out, I started coaching 20 odd years ago, and I feel like at least 10 of those years, if not more, were kind of what I describe as the wilderness years, because I got what I got on my education, but after that, there's not much out there. You're kind of digging around for bits of information here and there. But information now is so freely available. You've got great sources of information, such as, Rugby Coach Weekly. There's, the podcasting world has exploded. Blogging has become more prevalent. And even academics are making their stuff more accessible. So, the space is very rich. If you're getting, started in coaching, there's a wide variety of information out there for you to be able to digest and absorb. So I do feel kind of a little bit like that, when a young coach comes to me and says, "Oh, what should I, what should I read? What should I look for?" I almost think to myself, how can you possibly even ask that question when there's so much information available?
Yes, yeah. Though one of the things that I think is important for anyone who is in our positions, you maybe more than me, is to help create what is out there, because, as you say, there was an enormous gap, and hence why Rugby Coach Weekly and some of the things we did around that was able to really take off. Like you, and I daren't ask your age, but I'm nearly 50 now. So when I first started coaching when I was about 25, so that's 25 years ago, there was absolutely nothing out there. There was about 3 or 4 books, which became very dog-eared, and then there would be some coaching manual would pop up from South Africa, and you think, this is amazing, and what are they doing there? Yet your sources of information were so anecdotal that it was very difficult. I mean, I was very lucky in my short career of playing quite good rugby that I was exposed to some of the best coaching or best coaches that there were out there. For instance, there's a guy out there called Keith Lyons, who I don't think many people will know of, who was before his time, and he taught me at university, so that was fantastic. I was very lucky that there's another guy called Kevin Bowring, who I'm sure you know.
I do, yeah.
He was he helped me get into teaching. So just to have conversations with him was amazing. And then for others in rugby, we'll know the likes of Brian Ashton, Dave Aldred, who has written a very good book on the pressure principle. So I had short spells with all of these coaches. So when I went into coaching, I had some of those things behind me. And the scary thing is that what sort of coach would I have been then if I knew what I know now? I mean, I know people say that quite a lot. And it's part of the journey, yet where we are, it is an enormous amount of information as opposed to the little information and, frankly, some of the rubbish coaching that I did back in the mid-90s.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on something that's very important there, which is I also count myself as very fortunate to have been able to meet and have conversations with several, excellent coaches. And I think coaches learning from other coaches is definitely one of the most powerful ways in which you can do that. I mean, in many ways, that's what this podcast exists to do, is to enable coaches to hear from other coaches talking about their lived experiences. Because for me, that's certainly been some of the richest learning I've had. I mean, I've been, as you mentioned, Kevin. I mean, I'm very fortunate to work alongside Kevin, more or less, for 3.5 years. And every time you have a meeting with Kevin, there's a knowledge bomb going to be dropped at some point. So it was fantastic for me because whilst I was getting paid for it in a professional capacity, I was also able to gain some excellent knowledge. Rick Shuttleworth's another one. I've heard, I've spent time with like Dave Aldred, as you mentioned, and but of course I've had the benefit of working across a number of different sports contexts as well. So for me, I'm very fortunate that I've had that kind of experience. It's been really valuable. But I think you're right. I think this is also where having these kinds of conversations, and for me as well, it's what's important as well is there's a lot of information out there, but actually turning that information into practice can be very, very difficult for a lot of people. So actually hearing from people who are actively doing that and some of the challenges they face, I think can make such a difference to people.
I think it's also important that all the things you say there make me think of about 3 or 4 different things. One thing is that I remember Kevin Bowering saying, I've got this great book on coaching, which you can take Shakespeare quotes and put them into coaching situations. And he was dropping a few of those at a chat. And I was thinking, wow, I mean, that's just amazing. I don't even know where that book is. What is that book? Does it really exist? Well, it does exist because he kept talking about it. Yet those sorts of coaches use, also Lynn Kidman as well, was very influential in that. But the thing I was going to develop on what you just said is listening to coaches in real situations and realizing how dynamic coaching is. And it's very much in the moment, which is a phrase often used by coaches. How I think Rick Shuttleworth uses it quite a lot, that you can come with a great idea, yet the idea needs to adapt for the moment, for the players. And how many times have we turned up with a great plan for a session and, well, in the old days, ripped it up and gone away disappointed, and hopefully now change around. Yes. So, I mean, what I would like to know from you is, where is the balance between listening to coaches and reading? Because there is so much reading we could do.
I think it's a mix, isn't it? I think there's a mix of. I mean, I think one of the potential downsides, I suppose, of living in this information age is there is such a bewildering array of information. It's hard to know which sources to attend to, isn't it? And I suppose as a result of that, it can be easily, you can easily sort of fall into the trap of going into things that may or may not be of benefit. So I suppose the one thing I suppose that I would encourage all coaches to do is have a degree of healthy skepticism, and also to layer a filter onto everything. So, for example, firstly, be very open-minded with kind of healthy skepticism. So, but also, be prepared to experiment with, things to see how they work for you. Now, that also means if it doesn't work immediately, you don't just throw it out, but, be prepared to use a concept and kind of turn it into, or make it work in your way, in your context, because it's very easy for me to pontificate about, kind of a games-based approach or an ecological dynamics approach and this, that, and the other. But the context is everything, isn't it? I often challenge academics for saying it depends. Challenge them because they're sitting on the fence. But they're right in the sense that it's all about the context. In a school context, the environmental pressures and things like that are such that sometimes a coach has to act in a certain way. In a different context, they have, they can work in another way. So actually, I'm coming around to answering your question. I think the information source probably isn't necessarily the important thing. I think it's the ability to translate the information source into action, into practice. I actually think that for me, anyway, it depends on. I mean, for me, engagement with an individual like this, a conversation, I often find more valuable because I can make sense of something more readily. Reading certain things sometimes can be a bit more challenging because you can't question the person who's done the writing, and you can misinterpret maybe what they were saying. So that's just personally the way I kind of engage.
Yeah, well, that's because you're an auditory learner, not I'm being facetious, of course.
I know. I was going to say Dr. Dick B would be all over this.
That's right. I did. I coached at a school in the last couple of weeks, and so I've coached at about 4 or 5 schools in the last couple of weeks, so they won't know which one it is. And I've got in front of me a fantastic piece of paper which sets out what they want from the child and how they're going to deliver it. And it is a brilliant piece of paper, but almost right in dead center, they have something on learning styles. And it just everywhere. And also the school was full of the growth set growth mindset posters. And I feel if you've got a growth mindset, you don't necessarily believe in the growth mindset, because if you turn it round, you've got to keep thinking, well, is it really what it is? So I think that also needs to be challenged. We need to challenge ourselves. So one of the things I've started to do in recent times is, like you, probably say, I like that idea. Where is somebody who says it's not quite the right idea? And you often find somewhere on the internet somebody saying, okay, just be careful, think twice, which then makes you think, what am I actually going to do in front of anybody when you get out there? Because you just don't know. And I suppose turning everything around to where we sort of came to set up this podcast is my question over games, which I'm a big fan of, and accidentally did a lot of much back in the 1990s. Tried to play games rather than do drills, though really it was the games were because I couldn't think of another drill, as opposed to now where I try and gamify everything as much as I can. That's probably where I'm slightly worried that I've gone down this route, and I'm very much a believer in it, yet I'm using this healthy skepticism to think, am I actually doing it right? Am I making a mistake here? Am I stepping off the path? To use a metaphor which I think is used often, you've got to know your path to be able to step off it. Am I actually really stepping off the path into something which is the wrong way? Because it is about safety, and it is the big news story at the moment in rugby, and no doubt across all sports with concussion.
So the issue that you're exploring, really, I suppose, is the games-based approach what's the word? Is the games-based approach appropriate when it comes to scenarios where there's a potential for danger, and therefore do we need to use more, say, instructional and explicit approaches when there's a potential for danger in order to mitigate the risk of injury? Is that pretty much the question you're asking?
Well, that's the question I'm asking, because my anecdotal experience suggests that games is the way. And so the story that I tell is that, well, first of all, anyone who's listening who knows me and watched me through my rugby career will remember me as a non-tackler. I mean, I did have to tackle in the end, and I learned to tackle because if you play at a certain level, you've got to tackle. I wasn't a great tackler, and it took a long time for me to become a tackler. So I don't look at my own tackling journey, but I look at my children's, and we talked a bit earlier before the podcast about our children are our little experiments. And both my children learnt to tackle playing rugby, but there's not this sort of environment that you would expect. I used to go down to watch Swansea play rugby at St Helens, the famous St Helens ground of Gary Sober's fame, where he hit 6 sixes. And anyone who's been there will know that the rugby pitch, which is one of the best, probably might even be one of the best in the world because it's so flat and wide, has a whole cricket pitch around it. So you watch the game, and all the kids aged probably from 5 to 14 go and play rugby at the side of the pitch, right next to the concrete stand with the metal stanchions, right next to all the farm equipment which looks after the pitches, and the scrum machine. They're completely uncovered. There's no padding or anything like that. So these kids play full contact rugby against each other. And if the kid doesn't want to play, they don't play. If the kids want to play, they've got to tackle. So that's how my kids learnt how to tackle. So we then go through a whole range of ways of teaching players to tackle, like from step by step. Yet my kids learnt better by just playing those knock-around games. So anecdotally, it seems right. Is there basis to it?
You mean scientific basis?
Yes, please tell me. justify it to me so I can use it.
Well, as you know, this podcast and my Twitter feed is currently in the middle of what's the word? I don't know. An ongoing battle between two sides of an academic discussion, debate, I suppose, which is a side of the academic community that is aligned to what you might call, a more explicit approach and directive and instructional kind of approach to athlete development, and the perspective that where that comes from, where that stems from, as I understand the science, by no means am I going to put myself up there with some of the experts, but as I understand reading it, as I understand the science, the view is that the emergent approach, the learning, the kind of the ecological approach where players adapt movements according to environmental constraints. There are certain scenarios where certain techniques or certain movement patterns will not necessarily emerge by themselves. And without a more explicit teaching approach, you are essentially potentially leaving certain important movements out. And the best example of that is in the kind of what you might call the physical literacy space. So people often say that children learn to walk on their own. They learn to run on their own. They're never kind of taught. But there are some researchers who will say, yes, but they learn to walk badly. They learn to run badly. And actually, in order to optimize their movement patterns and therefore help them learn and develop more effectively within a physical activity context, actually, we need some implicit teaching and some instruction in the same way we would teach children maths, we would teach children to read. It's not necessarily something that you naturally do.
So can I just jump in there on that then? So I understand that idea. Yeah. And I use the walking, we learn to walk without someone instructing us. And then I can see why they say that physical literacy won't improve in some circumstances. Yet isn't it the case that if the child is motivated enough, they will mimic the others who are more successful and use that to say, well, what can I do differently in order to become more successful at what I do? Rather than them having to go to PE and jump over hurdles because they're told to, they go to PE and watch their mate jump over hurdle and watch them again and think, actually, I can do that, and I want to do it because I want to be like them.
Yeah. So again, I think obviously I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate here, but the rationale there, the argument there is maybe they will. However, they might also not. They might not be aware, depending on obviously age and stuff, but they might not be aware enough of their movement limitations. So therefore, they'll continue to repeat a potentially detrimental movement pattern over and over and over again until it becomes ingrained in habit. And then it becomes very, very difficult to sort of change that particular movement pattern. And so what a lot of the people use as an example is, and I can kind of understand where they're coming from, which is that if you actually look now at quite a lot of, even with all the knowledge we have about strength and conditioning, there is a strength and conditioning community working at elite, high level academy level, 16, 18, this age, basically fixing movement problems and their argument is we spend all this time fixing these movement problems when in actual fact, with an earlier intervention, we wouldn't have to do that. We wouldn't have to spend all this very, very, it's very time consuming, very costly. Whereas a relatively limited intervention earlier on might make all the difference to that individual. And it means it could stop them from getting injured. It could give them better athletic potency, all these sorts of things. So that's the argument that's used here.
Well, that being devil's advocate on the way back then. So these are coaches looking after 16 to 18-year-olds who will then go on to do what? Well, some of them will go on to become Lionel Messi, and some of them will go on to play Saturday afternoon football at the local local club.
Yeah.
And why do we need to intervene so early? It just, for me, PE lessons, I love PE because I love sport. It was just, that's the way I am. And yet I know some of my friends hated PE. And there were probably good reasons, because some of the PE lessons were horrendous. And yet the best PE lessons were the ones where we played a game. So there's PE in school, and there are schemes to improve physical literacy. I like the schemes. For instance, Chance to Shine have gone in with cricket, where you can see some fantastic videos of these kids playing something which eventually, in about 5 or 6 years' time, might resemble cricket. But at the moment, they're running around, having fun, dropping the ball. That, for me, is much better than trying to get somebody to throw a ball in a certain way, bend their knees in a certain way so they can eventually be able to lift weights or do whatever they're supposed to do in the future. I just sense that we got to recapture, and I think I'm probably speaking to someone who probably thinks this as well. I don't know, you might disagree. We've got to recapture that opportunity for children to really have a laugh, be puffed out at the end of it, doing something which resembles some of the sports. I mean, I'm not a fan of organised sport at 6 or 7 or 8. And I know I speak to coaches who are coaching 8-year-olds, and they do a great job. Why are they having organised sports? And why are they having matches at 8? I mean, it's just... then they're trying to train them in a certain way. Why don't you just come along, run around, fall over, get wet, have a hamburger or sausage roll at the end of the day, and go home?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I mean, if you spend any time listening to any of the stuff I put out, I totally agree. I think the bit here that's interesting, though, is the theoretical and methodological position where we're coming from here. So for me, the idea that if we help children to fall in love with movement, and when I say movement, I'm thinking in the broadest sense. I'm not just talking about, literally like, gymnastic movement. I'm talking about all forms of physical movement, whether that's within a game context or, climbing a tree, those sorts of movement. I mean, my children the other day, by the way, we were playing a game in the park after school where my daughter would grab my phone and was using the stopwatch feature on my phone. And they were her and my son and two other boys were timing each other at how fast they could get across the monkey bars, but they had to touch every monkey bar. And I just sat there watching this happening. I was sort of sat on the seesaw, just watching it all happening, thinking, "This is brilliant. I've done nothing here. They've created this game themselves." I think the only thing I did was say that I actually added in that you've got to touch every bar, because one of the kids, like obviously the older kids, could swing across 3 and they had an advantage. So I just changed it a bit to make it a bit more even. That was the only intervention that I had. But watching them find different ways of doing it and come across different, they would try different hand positions to see if they could go quicker backwards and all these sorts of things. And it was brilliant. It was like proper, what I tweeted the other day, it was an exploratorium for them. They were finding different ways. Now, for me, that is how I see the development of physical literacy. Those children were absorbed in a physical problem, and I thought it was amazing. I don't subscribe to the idea that we should get a group of children in a kind of line and they should do hopping and they should do, bounding and they should do lunging and they should, do all these different movements or in a very kind of prescribed and explicit way. That would work from an education standpoint. It would work from we have seen something happen in the context, but I don't feel like that's genuinely going to allow children to explore and absorb and find different ways of doing things. And as a result, and I'll get to the end of this, as a result, I feel that we're actually potentially putting a lot of children off physical activity in our attempts to help them become physically literate, and it's almost self-defeating.
Yeah, and what you've got there is something which I've been suggesting to a number of coaches on the courses I do, and one or two have done it, and they've come back to me and fed back on how it works, is something which I call free time. A concept I picked up from a long time ago when I was helping out on a cricket course. And it was a 4 or 5 day cricket course. And at the end of the course, as the kids were going home, we were asking them, what do you enjoy most? And most of them said, well, the best bit was free time. Now, we sat down afterwards and said, oh, well, that's a bit disappointing. The free time, after all the things that we'd done loads of games with them and had lots of fun. The guy who'd led it was very energetic. And then we realized, what were they doing in free time? What were they doing in that 45 minutes to an hour when they were having their lunch? What do you think they were doing on a cricket course?
I imagine they probably were playing. There was probably 2 people batting, 1 person bowling, and then loads of them fielding and all that sort of stuff. That was probably the game they were playing, I imagine.
Yeah, they were playing. They were off playing their own games of cricket.
Yeah.
Not anyone that we'd organised.
No.
Now, some of them weren't. Some of them were just having a chat. Some of them were standing around in a circle talking with each other. So the fact that they had that chance and given that equipment. So I said to some coaches, about 2 years ago now, why don't you try out this idea of free time? So right in the middle of your session, it's not a reward. It is going to happen. You know it's going to happen. After about 40 minutes, you know you're going to have 5 minutes of free time in the middle of the session. At that 5 minutes, you say you're not allowed to leave this area. You can use any of the equipment which is around, and we will stand at the side. So obviously, if anyone runs off or there's any potential danger, we can step in and step back and watch. So I asked the coaches, what do you think's going to happen? And initially said, oh yeah, they'll go off and have a game of rugby or something. I said, no, I don't think that will happen. I think what will happen is this. All of them will kick.
Yeah.
Then some of them will just have a chat. Some will sit down, some will have some water. Some might find a football and play football. Yet, over time, some of them will start to play a little bit of game. It just gives them that chance to do something which is not adult-led. Now, just to add to that one is that about 2 years ago, I was doing some filming for a rugby site with Clive Woodward, and we got there early with all the cameras and everything, and because it was Clive Woodward was doing it, every parent brought their child there well over an hour before the start. So top tip, if you want kids to turn up on time, get a World Cup winning coach to come down for the session. So there were all these kids waiting around to be coached by Clive Woodward. What were they doing? They were playing a full-on game of rugby. These were under 9s, under 10s, not hitting each other, but tackling each other using full tackling. Now, if we had that in our own training session, we would have done a full warm-up. We would have checked every single one had got their gum shields in. If you were a particularly good coach, you would check the studs. You make sure they've got their hats on. And off they went. And they just played rugby. So, as you said there, with that sort of exploratarium, there must be times within what we do, in the times we do, when the players can explore if they want to explore. And if they don't, then they don't have to. And we shouldn't worry if they don't, because some will want to and some won't. Which, again, brings me back to a point which we were just talking about. These players going to the strength and conditioning coaches, they're close to the top of their sport. And the strength and conditioning coaches are tearing their hair out because, well, quite a lot of strength and conditioning coaches have very short hair. So what hair they've got left, they're tearing it out because these players haven't been properly looked after. But if they were properly looked after when they were 8 or 9, how about the 95% of other kids who those sorts of movement patterns don't matter to? They just want to enjoy.
Yeah, and so there's a number of things here. I think so.
Sorry, I gave about 8 threads there in one one blast.
Well, no, but I mean, this is great. This is why I love these sorts of conversations. There's so many doors I can go down, but and I want to go down them all. But let me just sort of just picking up on this point you made about free time. I mean, I listen. I 100% agree. You did something very similar within the talent academy that I was leading for England hockey, where we would have a period of time that we called it a free swim. I don't know why we called it a free swim, but we did. And,
like that free swim.
Yeah, you could just sort of go and do kind of what you like. I mean, the only slight, it wasn't entirely free in that context because it was a learning environment. In the sense that we did want them to explore something that was important to them, but they could do exactly what they wanted to. And if they wanted us to help and to guide, we could, but we were there in a consultative capacity alone. We didn't go and impose ourselves. But what was really interesting about that was they didn't know what to do. They're so used to being told what to do. They didn't know what to do. And the first few weeks of it was, quite interesting that, genuinely, they would just, some of them would just chat and this, and that was fine. We were happy to do that. They got more used to it as they went through. So there's an element of that with young children. Well, not young children, these were 16, 17-year-olds, but younger ones. The other point you want to make about my mission in my coaching, and also I think what I'm trying to do in trying to convey a message to people is, I think all coaching should feel as much like free time as possible. Because, and this is the skill, I think, of the ecological or the environmentally driven approach, is you can create a really, really great problem for children to solve. And I call them, I've called them perceptual puzzles in the past. And you can create a problem that, like that example I used earlier with the kind of monkey bar game, that children will be completely absorbed in. I couldn't get them to come home to have their dinner. And they'll be learning. You don't have to be explicit about that. That you can see it right in front of your eyes, them trying different solutions. You can see them, working out different ways. And that's like very real, very live learning happening right there. Now, I could just as easily, couldn't I, have said to all of those children, right, well, if you hold your hands like this, and if you move your legs like this, and this, that, and the other, you'll be able to do it a lot faster. And they would have all probably followed my instruction, but I doubt whether they would have remembered that from the next time. So for me, from this learning perspective, I think this idea of, all I did was throw in one thing. You've got to touch every single rung on the monkey bars. That was the only thing I added. Now, to them, that was free play. I was just standing there watching, kind of trying to be semi-disinterested so they didn't think that I was, watching with too much intent. But I was absorbed in watching what they were doing. So for me, that's, I think, how all coaching should feel. The kids should almost feel as if you haven't coached them. Now, that's a challenge in itself. Because I
call that Jedi Coaching.
Jedi Coaching, love it.
Yeah, the way that you sort of you persuade them to do something which they didn't realise they were supposed to be doing. And we do it all the time in our own teaching by saying certain things or doing certain things, and then they will shut up. Like, if you're silent for a little bit of time, sometimes people become silent around you, for instance, or or it's like nudges in sports. If you get them to do something, they actually then start to display a different behaviour, which is the constraints in the game. So just going back, I know we're on off on another thread here. So one of the things, just picking up one of the great threads in your when you talked to Nick Levitt, is that how you pronounce it?
It is, yeah.
In his podcast, was how kids create a game and then play a game. Yeah. I think that's great when they do that. Yet sometimes it happens that they will create a game which is completely unfair. I don't think they often do change the sides around as much as we hope. That's my perception. I'd love to see the research on it, and I'm only questioning it because I think that kids will bully, they will taunt each other. There are some fantastic stories. There's a brilliant story last week which was very moving about that boy who brought the Syrian boy into their group, and it was lovely. Yet I don't see children doing that often. They shy away from being so bold. They much prefer to stay with their friends. So when you pick sides, you know what it's like. If you were the last person to be picked, you'd be absolutely distraught. That you were, oh no, we've got to have Dan in our team. That would be how awful to be at that. And I experienced that in various guises over the years. So it's interesting that you said that you did intervene with one thing. And I think that's really our role as coaches is to make it feel like free time. And our intervention just makes it even better. You're adding the, and afterwards you've enjoyed it so much you can have lemonade and ice cream.
Yeah.
Which for me, of course, is a great reward. For others, is they prefer beer and pie.
I think you're right in the sense that I think children are as capable of being cruel to each other as they are as being kind. I think what's interesting, though, about that for me is sometimes I think this driver around or children's behaviour may or may not be driven by a reflection of adult norms. And it's interesting, I think, when children play, or whenever I've sort of watched children play, I think I often see those sorts of behaviours kind of peak and trough. And this is the bit I think where I think you're exactly right about this, by the way. I'm with you on this. I think organised sport, it should happen an awful lot later. And interestingly enough, Ian Renshaw, who I just spoke to the other day, and he'll be on the podcast, the one before this. Ian Renshaw said the same thing. He thinks we should stop organised sport because kids aren't getting the opportunity to do this exploratory game, their own game, the side of the pitch type of game, Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that I think the challenge that we're facing with organised sport is that it invites certain adult involvement becomes far too prevalent within the child's sporting context. So we don't have what John Cottell talks about as being deliberate play. We don't have that. We have formal competition, and that obviously invites adult behaviours that can be more or less positive. But those interventions from adults as well, I think, then also cause some behavioural challenges with kids. So what you'd find is that if it was left to the kids to sort themselves out, there's obviously going to be tension, and there's probably going to be, the odd strop because such and such isn't doing it fairly, and he won't play by the rules. And we've all done the taking the cricket back home thing, haven't we? And I was very guilty of that as a child. Mostly, though, I think that's driven by a desire to have a good game that's fair. It's usually when it's unfair that these challenges come about. And so I think for me, I think the thing about this is I think kids need to go through that. They need to have that opportunity to have that discussion with each other. Some great books on this, and have the conflict and manage the conflict and try and resolve the conflict without adults getting in the way. And I'm bad at this. Two kids have an argument, immediately two adults get in the way and try and work it out amongst themselves. Then the adults have the argument while the kids go off and play. And it's like, what's happened to the world?
Yeah, that's right. And then they get told, well, you're right, you're wrong. And, oh, yes, he said, she said, that sort of thing. So going back to that idea then and the physical literacy. So let us say on the monkey bars, one of the movements is quite clearly, and I don't have much knowledge of monkey bar movement, is quite clearly incorrect. And the child keeps doing it. Maybe they don't keep doing it because of the free play, free swim idea that they mimic, but they keep doing it. Do you intervene or do you step back?
So first and foremost, I think we probably need to have a concept of what this idea of what correct is. So it's correct biomechanically. I suppose the point is that I try and not talk about correct, as opposed to there are perhaps things that are more efficient against the objective versus less efficient. So, for example, if the objective changed to how long can you hang on the monkey bars, how they're holding the monkey bars, for example, might be perfectly relevant, but because the goal was, remember, so there's two constraints, I suppose, here is touch every rung and do it within a time limit, or do it as fast as you can. They were all just trying to...
Okay, well...
Go on, sorry.
I was going to say then, just to take that one, when I say correct then, and I remember you said it, and it's that idea of being more efficient, is then, I'll take that one back then, safe. So they're doing something which might be unsafe, dangerous.
So they're doing it in a certain way that means they might fall off the monkey bars and really hurt themselves. Yeah. So like trying to okay. So do you intervene? Well, I think in the context of safety, where if you as an adult, a responsible adult, can see that there's a chance of a child really hurting themselves, obviously you'd be negligent if you didn't intervene, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. The point, I suppose, is to, and again, it comes back to risk assessment, doesn't it? So it's about how severe is the risk, and what are the potential consequences of that? So let's take the rugby context, because this is what we're talking about, isn't it? And the intervention. So the answer to the question is, do you intervene? Yes. The second question there, though, that is begged there is how. So could you intervene with an instruction? Yes. Or could you intervene with an explicit drill? Yes. But could you intervene in a different way? So I want to come back to this point you made at the top about whether games are appropriate or not. And the starting point here, the kind of premise or the hypothesis that you posed was, if we allow children more free play time, okay, maybe it's guided. So we say, we have a tackling game. So it feels like free play, but it's a game about tackling. Kids wrestle a lot and all that sort of stuff. Is that going to enable them to tackle more safely or less safely than if we give them some sort of kind of very explicit instructional drill-based approach? Now, I don't think there is any research on this, but you probably did, I imagine. Well, you've been coaching rugby a lot longer than I have, but I did my rugby coaching course 5 or 6 years ago, and it was quite an explicit approach to teaching tackling. In the safety course that all coaches have to do, Rugby Ready. Quite an explicit approach to, and quite a linear drill-based approach to how to learn to tackle. Now,
sorry, can you just explain to me, because I think I understand, what do you mean by explicit approach?
Instructional. So it's very much teaching the children the technique to tackle, where to put their head. There's an approach where, it's done on the knees, then it's, and roll to the ground, and so the children are learning how to fall safely, and the tackler is learning how to tackle safely and effectively, pulling tight to the body and things like that. It's very much a taught process. Now, that's the intervention that is recommended currently from a kind of IRB safety standpoint. It's I think it's a global course, the Rugby Ready course. I would be interested in looking at some research, and I'm going to talk to Ross Fisher on this podcast soon, because he's doing quite a lot of work in research into rugby injury. He's got some very interesting findings, actually, around collisions. And the interesting thing, and I'm going to ask him this question, which is, if there is any research out there that looks at injury rates since that Rugby Ready intervention came into being, whenever it did, versus prior. My suspicion, and it's purely a complete theory right now, is that since that intervention came in, injury rates have not decreased. So the intervention isn't working. I've got a suspicion injury rates have increased. Now, I know there's a whole range of variables. The game's become more serious. It's become faster, this, that, and the other, and all those sorts of things. What I'm saying is that this way of teaching coaches to teach safety in the tackle, I'm just using the tackle as an example, I don't think is having an effect that it's designed to have. So then I come back to, well, what could? I think what you described could. Giving children opportunities to tackle each other and have fun, because it's a fun activity. You didn't like tackling particularly, but a lot of kids do. And the game involves tackling, so therefore, why don't we give them lots of opportunities to tackle? Now, how do we intervene if they're doing it dangerously? Well, it's different, isn't it, then? Because if there's a problem, like, they get into a dangerous scenario, then we can intervene based on the problem we've seen, as opposed to kind of giving them this idea of a controlled technique that's designed to mitigate against the danger. Because the problem is, in the game, they get themselves injured because they try and make a tackle in a position that they've never seen before, and they get it wrong. So that's my theory on this.
Well, I think there's a danger here that we could come away just saying, I agree with you, I agree with you, I agree with you. And of course, I do agree with you a lot. And one of the things, I suppose, in a sort of, we're not scripted what we're saying. Me asking the question about unsafe, you sort of came up with the answer which I was looking for, which was the first thing is how to intervene, which is fascinating for me. It's a question that I've got an opportunity to, part of Connected Coaches, to ask questions to Eddie Jones, and hopefully this question will be part of it, is that how and when do you intervene? And I think a lot of people look to Eddie, and quite rightly, as a coach who's making the right sort of waves in coaching. So at what stage do you intervene? But another question, which comes out of what we're just saying, and if we've got a chance, I'd like to talk about my thoughts on how I'd introduce tackling, is do you do that explicit safety technique point before or during? So there's your children going off to do tackling training or a tackling game, and or they're on their monkey bars, and if they fall off the monkey bars because they've done something unsafe and hurt themselves, you could be told off for saying, well, you should have told them before that is unsafe. Yeah. So I suppose what Rugby Ready does is tries to cover off the coach so that should a child become injured during the game, at least they can tick off the box saying, well, I did say that was unsafe beforehand, and I did give them one or two ways of doing it correctly. Yet my contention is that tackling, like a number of these dangerous activities, they're dangerous because they're so dynamic. Yeah. Nobody wants to get their head in the wrong place. So you're taught where the best place to put your head is, yet things change so quickly. In rugby, the ball carrier is doing his very best to get out of the way of the tackler. If you do it on your knees, they've got to run into a very small space for you to do a perfect tackle. Yet in the game of rugby, they'll be moving around left, right, running at you fast, slow. So I think that the best way to learn is to give the tackler such a key nudge that it means that in the end they will find a safe way to do it. It's this Jedi coaching way. And my nudge is that they've just got to get their ear tight to the shorts. That's the only thing which then means that there's a tackle in the game.
And you could design a game, couldn't you, that involved, for example, it would almost be like a variation of wrestling, but the objective is to get your arms wrapped around somebody's legs and your ear tight to the shorts. And that could be the starting point.
Yeah, yes. And I've been thinking more about it, that you play in small areas where they don't have much chance for a run-up. I mean, I do it with walking rugby. And most people who play walking rugby think it's ridiculous. Yet when they play this walking rugby with this tackle idea that they've got to get the ear in, there's enough space for them to move and pass. And because the player's got to get their ear in close, it actually gives a lot of the good techniques that you need to tackle. Because to get your ear in, you've got to have your eyes open. Because if you close your eyes, you'll never get your ear in tight. Where your head goes, your shoulder goes. In order to get your head close, you have to use good foot movement. And if the ball carrier sneakily tries to beat you with a sidestep, because you've got your eyes open and you want to get your ear in close, you change. And those sorts of games, or just sort of very, very gentle, rough and tumble games, as you suggest, then with you perhaps intervening like you did with your free time with the monkey bars. Okay, I'm really enjoying this game. We might just say that if you do this, it's a turnover. Okay, just play. That the kids then just learn. I look at my experimental team, which is the team I took through at Mumbles, and we went right through from under 6s on the beach through to under 16s, and we did very little defensive organisation. We tried it a few times, yet the players through play worked out their own defensive system. Now, I'd like to think that I meant to do that from the start with the coaches I was working with. It was purely accidental. Yeah. So I'm thinking now, maybe that's the way I should coach them forward.
Yeah, and it goes back to Rick Shuttleworth's point around adapting to the problems that, so in the same way that we want the children to be able to adapt to a problem that they're trying to solve in the game, we as coaches are adapting to what those children are learning and what they need from us. And so often I think when we do, technique-led approaches, we're giving children movement solutions that they may not have to use. Or they may have to use in such a dynamic way that the way they've learned that movement just doesn't really apply. And so your point about dynamics is really important, hence the conception, to get a bit theoretical, the idea of ecological dynamics is the idea of skill as opposed to technique, skill being, being learned in a dynamic environment. So for me, if it's about safety, and we know that the dynamics of safety, and we're just talking about tackling, the dynamics of tackling is what causes most injuries, then learning in a modified dynamic environment, learning that particular skill, it's essential from a safety perspective. And I agree with you entirely as well. We're violently agreeing with each other. Where I think the idea of teaching this is it's a box ticking exercise. We have covered safety. It's to give the sense of the perception of we take safety seriously here in rugby. Parents, don't you? We keep your children coming to us. We take safety seriously. We're doing this thing called tackling safety, so your kids will be okay. And then they walk off crying five minutes later, because something dynamic happened in a game, and all of a sudden they've injured themselves. So my view is, and I think it's very important, not just from a safety perspective, but from an enjoyment perspective, that this dynamic approach to learning movement skills becomes central to the way children's experience of sport takes place. And the reason for that is, in all other walks of life, and my children, as all children do, are quite into video games and stuff that they can, screen time, and they, in that context, it's very dynamic. It's all about problem solving, and they're absorbed in it. And if our sport doesn't give them that opportunity for exploration, then I think we look like a pale comparison.
Well, this is a thread completely different, I expect, but I think that video games teach us a lot about how kids want to learn. There's a very old saying for those people who've lived in a different sort of life, but a good game is a quick game. And if you're spending a lot of time explaining the rules and the laws of the game, then they're not that interested and they find it complicated. Yet they will open up or start up a video game and they won't read the instructions, they'll go straight in. And as they're playing, they will discover solutions. And if they can't discover solutions, they may go back to the instructions or the help, or they'll go onto YouTube and they'll find something which tells them how to solve that problem. And the best video games have enough danger. And I'm old enough to remember when Doom came out, and I can remember getting to the point where I got to the end of the level and came up against the monster. I think there's probably a technical term for it. And I mean, my heart was beating horrendously, and I was 28, 29. I mean, that's a fantastic video game experience. But the key for me, and this is the key for all sports, and this is, again, going back to an earlier thread we were talking about organised sports, is the best thing about sport is there's always next week. Or if you're at school, there's always next break time. So you win at first break, you play the same game at second break, you play the same game after school, and you might have won the first one, lost the next two, but there's always tomorrow. And that is absolutely key for these kids, because they'll come back if there's another chance. There's enough in the game to make it that they're disappointed they've lost, yet there's enough to come back. And that's just like a video game, that there's enough jeopardy to make it exciting when you win.
And I think, yeah, you're right. And that's what makes it immersive. That's what makes it exciting. Like you say, it gives you the thrill. And it's why I think why all of us are participating, because we want to generate that challenge point that's going to give us the. And I think you're exactly right. Methodologically, I think for me, if a coach needs more than 30 seconds, and even that's a long time, 30 seconds to explain the rules of the game, it's too long. I mean, I use video game language in my coaching. I start the game off. It's a very simple game. And immediately, there's just maybe 2 rules. That's it, play. And then I layer it up and I just say, but I'll say to them, are you ready for level 2? Yeah, we're ready for level 2. Oh, I don't know if you are. Oh, okay. Well, let's try and let's see how you get on. There's level 2, new rule, boom, in we go. And so the game I wanted to start with all the different complexities, I get there in the end, but I start very simply and move towards it. And so, what am I doing? Adding in rules, adding in constraints. But I start always very, very simply, depending on the group, obviously, and then move up the layers and move up the levels. And they get so excited by the next level, the next level, the next level.
Yeah, this is again, we're violently agreeing here. And this is very much, I think, the way that often we think games are a good idea, and we do introduce a game with such a complex set of rules that the players take ages to find out. But also I found along those is that it's always worth coming back to the game in a couple of weeks' time, because in that intervening time, sometimes the players have thought about how they might win that game. There is a moment when they're driving in the car, they're standing in the shower, that they think, oh, actually, I should do that. So when they play the game next time, you give it a great name. I had a game called Get Out of Here, and I said, we're going to play Get Out of Here, and the kids would race around saying, great, it's Get Out of Here. I never thought it was a particularly good game, but they loved it. So they knew what the rules were. So they weren't learning the rules this time round. They were playing a more complex version of the game that we first started with, and they were immediately looking for solutions. So I think the danger is that we will set up a game hoping there's going to be some emerging behaviours from that, and they don't happen. Well, don't worry about that. It might happen next week or the week after. There's a guy who I've done some work with called Doug McClement, who worked quite a lot with the New Zealand team and the New Zealand coaches, quite scientifically based approach that he was involved in. And he said that the All Blacks would do a line out at the start of the week because in professional sport, for those who are unaware, that things like set pieces, they probably spend 1 hour in the whole week on line outs because they just don't have enough time. Do all the things. So they might do half an hour at the start of the week, and the players may not get the play or the move. Yet by the Friday, they would be pretty much getting it. Now, have they done any extra training in between? Probably not. But what they have been doing is their brains have been thinking about it in that time. They've been saying, "Oh, right, okay, that's why that happened." And at the most unusual moments, and then when they did it on the Friday, of course they're top of their game, they're well-tuned athletes, they get it. So the danger is that we do try these games out, and we will know, and you will probably have games where you think, this is always a good game, and the players don't quite get it for that particular session. Yet, if you're patient enough, something will emerge. If not, exactly.
I think you're right about that. I think we're quite often too quick to change. Sometimes there's value in the struggle. Going back to the growth mindset concept. Carol Dweck once said a conference that I organised. She said, "We don't ever go home, do we, and say, like, honey, I'm home. I had the most amazing struggle today." You've got to value struggle. But anyway, so I think there's value in the struggle. But the other point you make, which is a very important one, is that we should also. It's not always our view of what makes a good game that makes a good game. So, our starting point should be, you said I didn't think it was a very good game, but they loved it. Well, that's value there, isn't it? But I think one of the things I think that I think is worth sort of we can go in. Can you believe we've been going for an hour and 5 minutes?
Right,
but okay. Just in order to, and again, I could violently agree with you all day, but in order to sort of, I guess, wrap our conversation up a little bit, I think the point that I think we're generally making here around one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this methodology is I think it forces us to stop thinking about what we feel we need to impart to children, our knowledge to impart to children, and start thinking about the best experience we can provide for them that will enable them to learn the things that we're hoping that they're going to learn. So for me, it forces us to be immediately much more child responsive, player centered is the term people often use. And I think we get this win-win where we get skill, skill develops, I think, more effectively or could potentially develop more effectively. There's still room for intervention, and I'm not taking away, by the way, an explicit intervention. I think sometimes you're right. If genuinely there is, someone's going to do the equivalent of putting their hand in the fire, I think we should, at that point, step in. So I'm not taking that off the table. I think that should be, part of the mix as well. But I think it should be it should be a limited thing. It's like salt, should be used not to be used liberally. And then through that, the win-win of this for me is not only do we help these young people develop and explore their potential, but they're doing something that they can become immersed in and hopefully fall in love with. And therefore, we get both retention, engagement, and we get potentially improvement. So for me, that's why I'm so passionate about this approach.
Yeah, I think I'm passionate about it as well, as you can tell. And I think from the conversation we've had today, I've learned a couple of things which I think builds on some of the ideas. And the key really is not just the experience, as you said, and creating that environment where they love being there and they want to learn. It's just knowing that moment to step in and say, touch every rung on the monkey bar. And for them not to say, oh, Dad, you've spoilt it.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right.
And we adults spoil play. Oh dear! When the whistle goes right at the starting training, how many times? Even when in the olden days when I used to play rugby, and you'd be playing touch before the coach would say, "Right, we got to start training," and the players say, "Oh, really?" So I think their danger is we sometimes spoil play rather than make it funner. I think you did. Did you not use a word on the podcast with Nick, which was something like funny ism or something like that?
Funnest, you made the funnest thing you can do,
yeah, the funnest. There we are.
Right. Hey, Dan, I've absolutely. I mean, can't think of a better way to do to have a Saturday morning. I've had a really, really good conversation, and I've learned a lot through speaking to you. And that for me again comes back to the starting point around the best way for coaches to learn, I think, is through dialogue and ongoing conversation. So I'm very grateful for you for your time in contributing. I would be remiss if I didn't let people know how they can find you and find out more about what you're putting out on Rugby Coach Weekly and any other sources they might be able to find out more from you from.
They can follow me on Twitter, obviously, and just type Rugby Coach Weekly rugbycoach.net into there, or Rugby Coach Weekly. I mean, if we're not near the top of the Google rankings, something's gone wrong. But that's the key. The key also with all these things actually is that there's a great coaching community out there who are wanting to learn, and we're just one of those who are there, and we're constantly trying to evolve as a learning tool, because I think coach is evolving. And as you said right at the start, Stu, is don't we wish we had all this information back? Well, for me, when I started my coaching journey properly in 1994, when I started it, and there was so little out there. There were some great people coaching and sharing stuff. It's so much changed. So it's just brilliant to be part of that community, and I've learned a lot from today, and I love the fact that you and many others are sharing and opening up these doors and opening up the minds, and also making me uncertain. Hence why I asked the question, I suppose, in the first place. So, yes, I've enjoyed my struggle this morning.
So have I. So have I. What a great way to finish. Dan, really appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Okay, cheers.